The estate gates swung open, revealing the grand mansion, standing like a silent king in the heart of Lekki. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and well-trimmed flowers curved around the walkways like obedient soldiers. To outsiders, the Adikanal household was perfect: a wealthy lawyer husband, a successful businesswoman wife, and a life of comfort that many envied. But perfection is often an illusion. Miriam Adikanal sat in the living room, sipping from a glass of red wine, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the glass. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. She was lonely. Her husband, Tund, was always busy. Late nights at the office, urgent court cases, endless phone calls. At first, she understood. She told herself it was part of being married to a successful man. But as the years passed, that understanding turned into quiet frustration. Miriam wasn't just a housewife. She was a woman of power, running a chain of luxury boutiques across Lagos. Yet, despite all the success, she couldn't deny the growing emptiness inside her. She craved attention, passion, and something dangerous. That was when she heard the knock. "Madam." The voice was soft, almost unsure. Miriam turned her head and found herself staring at him. David, the new housemaid. He stood awkwardly at the entrance, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform. His face was young, almost too innocent for the world he had stepped into. He had deep brown eyes, the kind that held quiet obedience, yet something else lurked beneath him, something unspoken. "The cleaner said you wanted to see me," David said, his voice laced with nervousness. Miriam took another slow sip of her wine, letting her gaze linger on him. She hadn't paid much attention to him when he first arrived. He was just another employee. But now, standing there under the warm glow of the chandelier, she noticed things she shouldn't be noticing. The way his skin gleamed under the light. The way his collar sat perfectly against his neck. The way he refused to meet her eyes for too long. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. "Yes, David," she said, crossing her legs. "I just wanted to make sure you're settling in well." She shouldn't have cared. He was just a houseboy. But deep inside, something dangerous had been waiting. And the game had only just begun. David wiped his damp palms on his uniform as he stood before Miriam. Something about the way she looked at him made his stomach twist, not in fear, but in a way he couldn't understand. Her eyes held him longer than necessary, a slow, assessing gaze that felt too intimate for a simple employer-employee conversation. He swallowed hard. "This is just a job, nothing more." Miriam leaned back on the sofa, swirling her wine glass lazily. The silence between them stretched, thick and unspoken. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the hair on David's arms rise. "How old are you, David?" she asked, her voice smooth, like melted chocolate. 23, Ma." "So young," she tilted her head. "Where are you from?" "Benue, Ma." Miriam tapped her fingers against the armrest. "Benue boys, they are very hard-working, aren't they?" David nodded, unsure where this was going. He wasn't new to rich women treating house staff like they were invisible, but this felt different. Her tone, her body language, none of it screamed casual conversation. "I hope you like it here," Miriam continued. "Working in a house like this must feel like a big change." "Yes, Mom. It's a good job." She smiled again, but this time, there was something else behind it. Something dangerous. David felt it. That evening, as he cleaned the living room, he tried to shake off the strange feeling. He was here to work, to earn money, and support his struggling mother back home. But the way Madame Miriam had looked at him made him feel something he had no business feeling. And for the first time since he arrived, he worried. Not about the job, not about the house, but about her. Because whatever she wanted, he wasn't sure he had the strength to resist. David knew his place in the Adikanal household. He was just the houseboy, there to clean, cook, and stay out of trouble. But ever since that evening, he felt something shifting. Miriam was watching him. It wasn't obvious at first. Just little things. He'd glance up while sweeping, only to find her gaze lingering on him from across the room. He'd walk past her perfume-scented presence in the hallway, and she'd hold his eyes a second too long. And then there were her questions. Too personal, too unnecessary. One evening, while David was mopping the floor near the dining area, Miriam appeared, wrapped in a silk robe that barely held itself together. "David," she called softly. He froze, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. "Yes, Mom." She stepped closer, the soft fabric of her robe swaying with each step. "You work too hard," she murmured. "Do you ever rest?" David swallowed. The air was thick with something unspoken, something that made his skin feel hot. "I'm fine, Ma." Miriam chuckled, a deep, knowing sound. She reached for a bottle of water on the dining table, and as she did, her robe slipped slightly, exposing her smooth-toned leg. David quickly turned his eyes to the floor. "This is not normal. This is not right." "Relax, David," Miriam teased. "I don't bite." David forced a polite smile. "I still have work to do, Ma." Miriam stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took a sip of her water, watching him over the rim of the bottle. David forced himself to continue mopping, but his hands shook slightly. He needed to be careful, because whatever game Madame Miriam was playing, he wasn't sure he could escape unscathed. And deep down, he feared he wouldn't even want to. David lay on his thin mattress in the small boy's quarters, staring at the ceiling. The night air was cool, but his skin burned with an unfamiliar heat. What was Madame Miriam doing? This wasn't the way a boss looked at a housewife. This wasn't the way a married woman acted. Or was it? He had heard stories. Rich women who got bored in their big houses, looking for excitement in the wrong places. But this was dangerous. And the worst part, it excited him. He hated to admit it, but the way she spoke to him, the way her eyes stayed on him, the way her robe had slipped, it did something to him. A part of him, a part he wasn't proud of, wanted to see how far she was willing to go. A knock on his door snapped him out of his thoughts. His heart jumped. Who could that be at this hour? He hesitated before standing, wiping his sweaty palms on his shorts. Slowly, he pulled the door open. Miriam stood there, dressed in a thin nightgown. David's breath caught in his throat. The corridor light cast a golden glow on her skin, making her look almost unreal. She held a wine glass in one hand, her nails painted deep red. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's mind screamed at him to shut the door, to run, to pretend this wasn't happening. But his body refused to move. Miriam took a step closer. "Are you afraid of me?" His throat was dry. "No, Mom." She smiled, slow, deliberate, dangerous. "Good," she murmured, tilting her head. "Because I don't like men who are afraid of me." David felt his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it, the moment he had to decide. To step back into safety, or to step forward into fire. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which one he wanted more. David gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white. This is a test. It has to be. Miriam stood so close now that he could smell the wine on her breath, the soft, floral scent of her perfume wrapping around him like a dangerous spell. The night air was cool, but her presence set his skin on fire. She took another step forward, her bare foot crossing the threshold of his tiny room. The line had been drawn, and now she was erasing it. "I see the way you look at me, David," she whispered, swirling the wine in her glass. "You think I don't notice?" David's throat went dry. He had been careful, or so he thought. "Ma, I respect you," he said, his voice almost shaking. Miriam let out a soft laugh, stepping even closer until their bodies were nearly touching. This wasn't respect. This was a game. "Respect," she echoed. "Is that really what this is?" David's heart pounded. Every part of him screamed to step back, to shut the door, to remind himself that this woman belonged to another man. But another part of him, the part that had noticed her beauty long before now, the part that felt something stir every time she stared too long, that part wanted to know how far this would go. Her fingers reached out, just barely grazing his chest. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a shock through him. This is wrong. This is dangerous. This is intoxicating. David sucked in a sharp breath. "Madam, we shouldn't." She cut him off with a soft tone, tilting her head. "Do you think I'm happy, David?" He blinked. The question caught him off guard. Miriam sighed, stepping back slightly, her expression unreadable. "Do you think a woman with a perfect house and a perfect husband is truly happy?" David didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he already knew. She wasn't happy. And he was becoming the solution to a problem he had no business fixing. Miriam smiled again, this time softer, almost sad. She lifted her wine glass to her lips, took a slow sip, and then, just as smoothly as she had arrived, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the dimly lit corridor. David exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. The moment had passed. The line hadn't been crossed. Not yet. But the worst part, he wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed. David barely slept that night. His mind replayed every second of what had happened at his door. Her voice, her touch, scent of her perfume lingering in the air. By morning, he convinced himself it was over. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she was just testing him. Maybe it was all in his head. But when he entered the kitchen to start his morning duties, Miriam was already there, waiting. She leaned against the marble counter, dressed in a silk robe again, her hair pulled into a loose bun. The smell of coffee filled the room, but all David could smell was her. "Good morning, David," she greeted, her voice calm, like nothing had happened. "Good morning, Mom." He kept his eyes low, pretending to focus on the dishes, but he could feel her watching him. Every movement, every breath. "You didn't sleep well," she said softly. David's heart skipped. How did she know? "I slept fine, Mom," he lied. Miriam walked slowly towards him, the sound of her slippers tapping softly against the tiled floor. She stopped just behind him, so close he could feel her warmth without her even touching him. "You're a terrible liar, David." David's hands trembled slightly as he scrubbed the plates harder. "Madam, please," he whispered, his voice barely steady. Miriam's soft breath brushed his neck, sending chills down his spine. "Please what?" she asked, her voice teasing. David squeezed his eyes shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel himself losing control, trapped between the fear of getting caught and the forbidden excitement pulling him in. This woman was playing a dangerous game, and the worst part was, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to stop. Before he could say another word, the sound of the front door unlocking echoed through the house. Tund was home. Miriam quickly stepped back, a sly smile on her lips. "Your secret is safe with me for now." David's heart pounded as he watched her walk away, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the taste of temptation that would haunt him for the rest of the day. David's hands trembled as he wiped down the kitchen. His mind wasn't on the work, it was on her. Madame Miriam, the way she had whispered against his skin, the way her breath had made him weak, the way she had retreated just in time before Olga Tund stepped in. David knew he was walking on thin ice. One wrong step, and everything could shatter beneath him. "David," he jerked at the sound of Tund's deep voice. His boss had just walked into the kitchen, stretching his arms and yawning. The man was tall, muscular, and had the kind of presence that made people afraid to cross him. David swallowed hard. If he knew, if he even suspected. Tund rubbed his beard and opened the fridge. "How far?" "Any food?" "Yes, sir. I'll serve you now." David moved quickly, scooping hot jollof rice onto a plate. His hands worked automatically, but his mind raced. Miriam was upstairs. Did she feel as shaken as he did? Or was this all just pain? As he placed the plate on the dining table, Tund suddenly asked, "So, how's my wife?" David froze. His grip on the tray tightened. Was this a trap? Was he testing him? Tund raised an eyebrow. "What?" David forced a smile. "She's fine, sir." Tund smirked and grabbed a spoonful of rice. "Good. Hope she's not stressing you too much." He laughed. "Women, eh? Sometimes they can be something else." David forced another chuckle, but inside, his heart was hammering. Tund had no idea. He was sitting across from the same boy his wife was hunting like prey. Just then Miriam walked in. David's entire body stiffened. She was wearing a fitted red dress that hugged her figure. Tund barely glanced up, too focused on his food, but David, he couldn't look away. She walked past him, slow and deliberate, her perfume lingering in the air. She didn't even acknowledge him, but as she sat opposite her husband, she casually slipped a grape into her mouth and locked eyes with David. Just for a second. But in that second, everything was clear. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. Thank you for watching. Kindly like, comment, share, and subscribe for more videos.